This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence. Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be sharing with you the 8 books that I have loved the very most so far in 2022. I felt sort of, I don't know, like weird about my reading this year, but then I was going over my spreadsheet this morning and there was actually 27 books there. So in actuality, that's pretty good. And I had a look and there's been quite a number of wonderful books that I've read that I've absolutely loved. And those are the books I'm going to be sharing with you guys today. So without further ado, without any more rambling, let's just jump straight into the video, and here are my favorite books that I've read so far this year. Book number 1, I read this book actually in a reading vlog towards the beginning of this year, and it is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This is a book that had been on my TBR for a really long time, mostly because I love magical realism and I've been recommended this book just so many times by people. And it's about this family which live in Colombia. It's essentially set over the course of 100 years and it follows the Buendia family, and they have this really interesting life. A lot of people have said that this is the book that the movie Encanto was based on. We have this family that have a certain amount of magic associated with them. It's kind of a really interesting gentle magic. The patriarch of the family, Jose Arcadio Buendia, everyone in the family is either called Jose Arcadio or Aureliano. He with his wife built this house and the many generations of his family after them all live in the house, and we sort of get to see the village around the home grow and change with the many decades that pass. We see wars, we see magic come to the village, and we get to see the lives of all the many people in this family, and it's just so interesting and colorful and uniquely constructed. I thought this book was just absolutely remarkable. It's kind of hard to explain. It's a little bit weird and wacky, but I just love the storytelling here. I'd never read a book like this before. The way that death is treated in this book is really interesting. Just so beautifully, brilliantly done. I really love this book. It's very, very interesting. I still have my little map in here that I did of me trying to... Don't look too closely here because there's spoilers if you squint at the messy little writing. But I had to like keep tabs on the family so I could remember who was who, because they all have the same bloody name because all the men are either called Jose Arcadio Buendia or Aureliano Buendia. Moving on to book number 2. I tell you what, there's been a few books here that I've actually read in reading vlogs. So for some reason, my taste this year specifically for reading vlog content has been pretty good. Another one I want to recommend is Julia and the Shark by Kieran Millwood Hargrave. This is a beautiful middle grade story about a girl named Julia whose mother is a marine biologist, and they move to these islands in the very north of Scotland. I've never been to the UK, I don't know the names of these places. Shetland, the place of Shetland ponies? Is that where the horses, the little cute ones, come from? They moved to Shetland, which is like really, really north in the UK, and the mother of the family, who is the marine biologist, is looking for this Greenland shark who's supposed to be very, very old. It is a beautiful, poignant story. It's really hard for me to describe the specific thing about this book that I love without giving away spoilers towards the end of the book. I thought this book was surprisingly deep and surprisingly profound. I really love the writing here. I did honestly feel transported to Shetland, to this cold sort of little town next to the sea where this mother is looking for this shark, and it's a beautiful short little story. You can definitely read this in one sitting, and the end made me cry a little bit. I just thought it was so vulnerable and honest and beautiful, and I love that in children's books. Like, I feel like children's books, it's really important for authors to not shy away from real world themes, is what I'll say. One of my favorite children's book authors is Jack William Wilson, and I remember being a kid and reading books like Tracy Beaker and the Fairy Floss one, Illustrated Mum, and like all of these different books, and then having really like adult themes but translated for children, and I really appreciated those books when I was a kid. And so I love it when authors find creative and reasonable ways to introduce more like real world themes to children through their stories. I think it's really important for learning and for socializing kids and for giving them the tools to be able to navigate the real world when they do face harsher problems, because you know that kids, I'm rambling here. Anyway, the point is this book deals with some harsher themes, but I thought it was beautifully, brilliantly done. Book number 3 is a book that we read for our book club over on Patreon for the month of February, I think, towards the beginning of the year. It is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. This book is significant because it was the first science fiction book published by a black woman. I had read the sort of premise of this book and it sounded really interesting to me, and so I wanted to pick it up. This story follows our main character, whose name is Dana, who was a black woman living in America in the 1970s, I believe. 1976 is the modern day setting for this book, and this is around the time this book was published. We have our main character who suddenly finds herself with the ability to time travel, and she actually goes back in time to 1815 to the South when slavery was still very prevalent. And so the story is about how she navigates suddenly being transported to the South during this time as a black woman. She's transported to the house of one of her distant ancestors, whose name is Rufus, who is a white child. You get to sort of see the very beginnings of Rufus being taught these horrible values by his parents because they are slave owners. And so we see Dana sort of going back and forth between modern America in 1976 to 1815. And the way this book looks at slavery through Dana's lens is really interesting and brilliantly done. And I really loved getting to explore this historical time. And I think the author did an amazing job at making this feel really suspenseful, a little bit scary for Dana at times. You also get to see how Dana, a modern woman, is treated during the slavery period, and how she, because she's a black woman, gets treated. And so the allegory here, the social commentary, and the way that this book explored slavery and racism, I thought was brilliantly done, and I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was so good, so well written. Before we move on to the next book on this list, I just wanted to thank the sponsor of this video, which is Squarespace. Squarespace is a website builder which allows people to create beautiful websites with ease. I built my website through Squarespace and I absolutely love it to bits. It's so easy to update and to maintain and to make everything look and work together exactly how I want it to. Squarespace has loads of lovely templates to choose from. It's affordable and it has tons of benefits, from its fabulous e-commerce features to its powerful analytics tools. If you're looking to make a website, head to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/ChristyAnnJones to save 10% off your purchase of a website or domain. Moving on to book number 4, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I cried quite a bit reading this book. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. It's absolutely worth the hype. This is an extremely hyped book. Came out in 2017. I feel like I jumped on the Evelyn Hugo train very, very late, but regardless, I loved this book. I thought it was so excellently written. I especially loved the way that gender, grief, and fame and ambition and all these like themes were explored through the book. This book is about a woman whose name is Evelyn Hugo. She was a movie star back in the 50s, and she is this extremely famous and popular actress who's had this amazing life after having come from nothing, and the 7 husbands that she marries along the way. We start off in modern day with Monique, who's a writer who gets asked by Evelyn Hugo to write her biography. And so Monique goes and interviews Evelyn, and then she starts to learn the story of Evelyn Hugo's life. It's a really cool premise just in and of itself, having a story that goes over the life of this glamorous movie star. But particularly what I loved about this book is the fact that Evelyn Hugo is just so nuanced as a character. She does so many things that are quite dislikable, and she's just so real and honest. She will do anything to protect the people that she loves. She'll do anything to sort of climb to the top and to seek her ambition. And I think this is a really beautiful story about a person who fundamentally just wants to be loved and have love, but who has translated this into her need for ambition and her want for fame and success within acting. I really love the unapologetic way that this book looks at sexuality, and I just thought the like tragic elements of the story were beautifully done. Book number 5 on this list is Lud in the Mist by Hope Mirrlees, which is a fantasy novel that's pre-Tolkienian that was published in the 1920s, and it's about this town called Lud in the Mist, which sort of sits right next to fairyland. We have our main character whose name is Nathaniel Chanticleer. He is a middle-aged man who is the mayor of the town, who at an earlier point in his life had a run-in with fairy magic. And in this world, fairies are sort of seen within the like traditional sense of they're quite mischievous famous. They're kind of these like scary, like otherworldly beings, and the idea of fairies and fairy magic terrify the people of this town. And earlier in Nathaniel Chanticleer's life, he has a run-in with fairy magic, which he hears in the form of a musical note. When he picks up this lute, magical note that he hears sort of follows him around his life. And then, without wanting to give away spoilers, there ends up being a situation in which Nathaniel Chanticleer's family is actually affected by fairies and fairy magic. He, as the mayor, has to figure out what to do. This book, in a few different ways, was kind of just weird and absurd and beautiful. It felt so interesting to read. I really loved getting to read a pre-Tolkienian fantasy published in the 1920s because it just felt so much like something I hadn't ever read before. It really does have a very strong fairy tale vibe. And again, as I've said many times on my channel, I love the 1920s, and so I particularly loved getting to read a book that was written during this time. Before Tolkien, fantasy did not exist in the same way that it existed after Tolkien. Like, he was very, very influential to the genre, and so this book is really special and I really enjoyed reading it. Book number 6 on this list is The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. I read The Secret History last year and really loved the process of reading that book. I thought that Donna Tartt was such a brilliant author who's incredibly talented, and I wanted to check out more of her work based on how much I love The Secret History. I was nervous that I wasn't going to love The Goldfinch quite as much, but I was blown away by how much I loved it and how brilliant it was. It felt very different to The Secret History, but so beautifully, brilliantly done, and I couldn't tell you which one I love more out of the two of them because I love them both for different reasons. The Goldfinch is a story about a young boy whose name is Theo Decker, who lives in New York City with his mother. He goes into a museum one day, and unfortunately the museum is hit with a terrorist attack. The museum is actually blown up, and in the process of this happening, sadly, Theo's mother dies. Theo, in the wreckage, discovers this painting, which is by Carol Fabricius. There we go, that's the name of the painter. This is a real painting, this does actually exist, but in the story, Theo finds this painting and ends up running away with it because he's just in shock after the whole museum's been blown up. And essentially the book is a Bildungsroman, so a coming of age story that follows Theo's life after the death of his mother and the incident in which he steals the painting and the implications of what that has on the rest of his life. The book is so beautifully written. Donna Tartt is an absolute genius with writing, with words, with theme, with all of these things. She just is so brilliant at constructing worlds that feel atmospheric and believable. The way she does imagery is like just astounding. I love her writing so much, and I think she's really, really talented. But I also really love the themes of this story. I love how it looks at fate and the way that people like reach for beauty and we reach for things that aren't necessarily good for us, and the way that sort of luck works with our lives and how some of us have an easier pathway than others. And it's kind of a slower paced story just because it's so large. Like The Secret History, there are moments that feel quite suspenseful where you don't know what's going to happen. I really cared about the characters. I felt like all the characters were very nuanced. I loved the way that it looked at art and restoring things, and I particularly love the characters of Hobie and Boris. Like, those two, I love them to absolute bits. I kind of want to go watch the film, but I know the film has really bad reviews. But yeah, basically I love this book. I thought it was absolutely excellent and I cannot recommend it enough. So very interestingly, the last 2 books I have on this list are books that I finished in the last week. Apparently I've had a really good week of reading. The 7th book on this list is called Passing by Nella Larsen, and this particular book is actually a really quite short book, so I think you can read it in one sitting. Like, it didn't take me very long to listen to. I listened to it as an audiobook. It is a story set in Harlem in the 1920s, written in the 1920s, and it is about this woman whose name is Irene, who is a light-skinned black woman who tends to pass as a non-black person in her daily life in New York. Obviously in the 1920s, with segregation, with racism being what it was at that time, this is really significant to how she navigates daily life. And it looks at Irene, who is the main character, and the relationship of her to a friend that she had when she was quite young, whose name is Claire, who she comes back into contact with as an adult. Claire is in the same boat as Irene because she is a light-skinned black woman who often passes for white. But it looks at the 2 journeys of these women, because one of them, which is Claire, marries a white man, but Irene marries a black man, and it looks at the concept of passing, and it looks at the culture of black versus white Americans in Harlem in the 1920s, and Irene sort of disassociates from Claire because Claire has essentially turned her back on her culture and people. The story was really interestingly done. I really loved getting to read about this perspective in this particular time because we don't have very many stories from people of color set in, you know, the early 1900s or before. And so I loved getting to read about America from this perspective during this time period. I love how even in a really short space of time, the book was incredibly engaging, and I feel like it covered a lot of ground. Like I feel like I really got to understand a lot of the characters, and there were a couple of little tragic moments that happened where I felt really, really gripped and really sad. Again, I really love the way that this book considers race, how it considers passing, how it considers the way that people are treated based on not just who they are and what their heritage is, but how they present themselves in the world. And I just thought it was such a brilliant, interesting little book. Moving along to the very last book on this list, and this is this beautiful, beautiful book that I just finished reading. And by just finished reading, I mean I finished reading this book at about 11 p.m. last night. It is She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. Oh my god, this story. I'm still sort of sitting in the little lip that you sit in after you finish a really big epic story and you just don't really know what to do with yourself. We're actually reading this book together this month for our Patreon book club. And the reason why I wanted to read this book initially is because A, I've read a lot of really positive things about it, and B, this is the first book written by an Australian author to ever be nominated for a Hugo. And the Hugo Awards are these really influential science fiction and fantasy awards. Just kind of because of that, I wanted to pick up the book and support this author, but I just flew through this story. I loved it to absolute pieces. I thought it was so brilliantly done. I need to tell you guys about the book before I start rambling anymore about how much I loved it. This story is set in 1300s China during a time in which the Mongols, they were the ones ruling China. I believe it was like 10 generations after Genghis Khan or something like that. And it's right before the Ming Dynasty. One of the things that Shelley Parker Chan has said quite a bit is don't use this book as a history book. Like it's supposed to be creative and fun, and it takes these like real world things that happen and puts a bit of a creative spin on it. And I felt like the author did such a brilliant job at constructing this world and making it feel really concrete and specific and believable, and I felt so transported to this world. I loved it to absolute bits. We actually have two sort of significant characters here, but the character we start with is named Zhu, and she is born into a impoverished village in rural China in a family in which many of her brothers and sisters have already passed away due to famine. Her mother has passed away, and so she's left with just her elder brother and her father. And eventually bandits come to her home, her father is killed, her brother dies of starvation. It's a very bleak beginning to the story, but this all happens really, really quickly. And then Zhu, which Zhu is her last name, right? We don't ever actually get to find out her first name. Zhu decides that she's going to take her brother's fate. She takes his name and his identity and she becomes Zhu Chongba, and she ends up going and living in a monastery. And then the story sort of kicks on from there. I don't want to give away too much. There is another significant character in here who I think was really, really brilliantly done, the other main point of view character. I loved all of the imagery. I loved the monastery. I loved how beautifully that was depicted and how like strong the imagery was there. The stakes and the suspense were so well done here, and I just love how the author made this particular book so engaging and so suspenseful, in addition to having these really beautiful passages of imagery while exploring the theme of fate and seizing one's fate. I really also love the way this book explores gender. I think it was done in such an interesting way, particularly because Zhu ends up impersonating a man, and so she ends up not really identifying with being a woman. And so we look at Zhu's identity and her journey in this world in which femininity and womanhood is very much looked down on as and seen as being worthless and nothing, and how Zhu navigates that. This book was so amazingly written. I loved how well researched it felt. I just loved so many of the elements here, and I'm so glad it got nominated for a Hugo because it definitely deserves it. And that was the very last book on my list of my favorite books that I've read so far in 2022. These books gave me so much joy. I had so much fun reading this particular stack of books, and I really hope that you guys found some good recommendations out of this list because I love all of these books so incredibly much. Thank you so very much for watching this video, and also an enormous thank you to everyone over on Patreon for supporting my channel. Over on Patreon we have a whole bunch of lovely bonus content, including bonus videos, our book club, a private Discord server, all of this great stuff. So if you want to check it out, there's a link in the description down below. Take care everyone, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.